All right, guys, back on Southeastern 16 with Max Barr. We have made it to the Alabama Crimson Tide in our SEC basketball team previews for the 24-25 season. Max, plenty to talk about with the Tide coming off a Final Four appearance, and now, believe it or not, expectations may be even higher for Nate Oats' team entering the 24-25 season.
How much just 1 year can change, Blake? Just unbelievable the ascension of Nate Oats in this program. You want to talk about a legitimate title contender? The numbers are backing that up. They're second right now to win the national title in the BetOnline odds, just behind UConn, of course. I even think that is just more of a courtesy to UConn and Hurley. I don't think that's more of like UConn looks to be better. I think you could make an argument. Alabama's got the more talented roster, but we're not going to get into that. But then BetOnline actually just released the conference odds, and Alabama is just a slim plus 200 to win the SEC championship. That's first, of course. But man, plus 200 is quite the slim odds. That's a pretty good indication of where the odds makers think this Alabama team's going to end up.
Well, before we, as always, we'll break down, kind of the backcourt, front court, give you our X Factor picks, MVP, and then predictions for the season. I mean, I think with Alabama, you kind of have to start with the injury situation. We're doing this in,
Yeah.
early October. And the guy we interviewed, Chris Youngblood, if you want to check that out, Alabama fans, you can check out the link to that. I'm sure we'll put it on the screen at the end of the video. Go back and watch our interview with Chris Youngblood. But he's going to be out for a little while. Max seems like should be ready for conference play, but not having him for what we know, as always, is a grind of a non-conference schedule. A lot of big matchups on tap for the Tide. It's not ideal to have our guy Chris Youngblood not out there. Some other guys not out there. As of right now in practice. But again, I still think though, at full strength, if you're looking at this Alabama team once they get into conference play and beyond, I mean, it's the depth that we talk about, with this team and everything that's really going to stand out. And I think that's where not having a Chris Youngblood for a couple months, that's where the addition of an Aden Holloway was huge, right? Because now, you've got him there. You've talked about Labaron Philon. Latrell Wrightsell's back. Of course, Mark Sears is back leading the way. But I think depth is very important, and we knew that coming into the season, but little did we know how important that was going to be when you had, an injury like this early on to kind of see how this team adjusts, at least in non-conference play.
Yeah, you never want to see a team start out shorthanded, kind of similar to Mississippi State last year. We just could not get an idea on them without Tolu Smith. We were like, I mean, guys, there's some of their best players are out here. It's kind of hard to tell right now. And, and it's not going to be to that level, but Derrion Reid is also out right now, hand injury. He should be back for the Wake Forest scrimmage next Friday. That's so cool to say that we got basketball within 2 weeks. But that's the one thing. I think it's going to be a blessing in disguise. I do, because I think when you look at the way that this team was built, the front court is just money. The back court, money. You go to the wing, there's a little bit of less, more questions on the wing than you would say in the backcourt or the front court. And the injuries are going to kind of amplify that early, with Youngblood and Reid kind of missing out on some early season practices. I think you're going to have to throw Latrell Wrightsell right back into the fire, Houston Mallette, but also Philon. I think Philon at 6'4", he's got that lengthy frame. If you watch the about that 20-minute practice clip that they released, Philon just looked fantastic, especially on the boards and defensively. So I think Philon's going to have to probably play a little bit more than they thought coming in. But those injuries, once they get healthy, I think it'll be a blessing in disguise.
Yeah, I agree. I think we say that about a lot of teams each year is you're going to get different rotations. It's not going to look the
Yep.
same in November as it's going to look in March, and we know that for every team. It's just that there's going to be changes, and especially when you have injuries that force that. And I think like with Latrell Wrightsell, like I think it's easy to forget like how important we talked about that guy was for that team last year, and then of course he missed some games due to injury. They're late, but I mean, we were talking about like again how important he could be just in terms of his scoring ability and shooting and all that. And like you mentioned, I think it's very intriguing to see what Aden Holloway is going to be, within the system. And and how they play there. And I mean, look, it's Alabama. They're going to play a certain way. We know that. Like, we know how they're going to play. This isn't like some teams where each year it really just depends on who's on the roster. They're going to play the Nate Oats way, and they have the pieces to do that. Like, they're not going to really change a whole lot. But, when you kind of look at the front court too, you think about it. I mean, right, it's still depth. Like, depth is still that's still the biggest thing that stands out. I mean, because you're looking at it, and it's like, all right, they got the luxury of bringing back Grant Nelson, but then they bring in Big Cliff, and so now you compare two 6'11" guys in the front court to start. But oh, by the way, you've also got another 6'11" future NBA player in Jarin Stevenson who's back,
Yep.
and so just that trio right there, if you start at that point for Alabama, they've got one of the strongest front courts in the country, if not the strongest, 1 through 3. When you think about, just the way these guys are going to match up with other teams, it's going to be really hard for other teams to stop what Grant Stevenson can do, or not Grant Stevenson. I'm like putting everybody. I'm combining into the super player that is Grant Stevenson with Jarin Nelson. But you think about though the combination of those guys with Big Cliff, and it's just, I don't know, man. This team's going to be able to do so many things well in terms of their big guys, whether it's scoring, whether it's rebounding, whether it's blocking shots, the rim protection. I mean, they've got it all when you start with that trio right there in the front court. But before we continue, let's tell you about our friends at BetOnline. If you want to bet on, Max, those Arkansas Final Four National Championship odds this season, if you're calling the Hogs already, you can also call, maybe not call, maybe just, type it up with your fingers or something like that. You can't really call anymore, I don't think.
No.
But you can visit our friends at BetOnline, the world's most trusted betting platform and your number one source for everything football and basketball, Max. We're going to add that in. Every stat, matchup, live odds during the games, it's all there. If you know your stuff, you can also play that $200,000 mega contest where you pick 5 games against the spread every week for your chance at weekly prizes and a share of $200,000. When it's over, head to the online casino, play some blackjack or poker. Over 150 slots games there as well. Head to their website today to get on the action. Bet online. The game starts here.
Yeah, and I'm glad you highlighted it because I was going to talk about it a little bit as well. Everyone's talking about Big Cliff with the defense, and rightfully so. I mean, absolute monster around the rim. But what is kind of I was digging into Nate Oats and his Ken Palm trends, and one thing that stood out to me was Alabama's offensive rebounding. Very, very underrated offensive rebounding team. The past 3 years, they've been top 25 in the nation in offensive rebounding. 3 years ago, they were 12th. And then the past 2 years, 24th and 25th. And they were extremely undersized last year, playing Grant at the 5 the whole year, pretty much. And putting in a reclass Jarin Stevenson in big minutes that he wasn't expected to get. They were still 25th in the nation in offensive rebounding. Now you add these guys, I would be shocked if they're not a repeat, again, top 25 national offensive rebounding team. And you add that with a top 20 3-point attempt rate. I mean, that is a Nate Oats team to a T. He was asked, I believe it was on the Next Round Live. There's a Nate Oats interview. I believe it was just yesterday. And they asked him, "Is this your deepest roster?" And usually when you ask a question like that, I feel like the coach is going to kind of dance around it. He said, "Yep, I think it is. Like 1 through 13, this is my deepest team." And I was just like, I agree with you, Nate.
I don't think there's any question. I mean, I think you look at the team on paper, and like we mentioned, even with an injury here or there, that's what depth's for. And I mean, they have the depth, and they are. I mean, really, it's like they have a backup at pretty much every position that I think could start for multiple SEC teams. Right?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that's unreasonable. If you were going by who you think's going to start, who you think the backup's going to be right behind that person at certain positions, I think pretty much everybody in that backup role would be starting for potentially several other teams, at least in the SEC. So that's the luxury that this team is going to have. And so I think, when you just go through it and you see all the potential all SEC players on this roster, I mean, there are just so many of them. And I think the front court, and we know, like, it's Alabama, right? And, you talked about like the offensive rebounding rate and those kind of things. I'm sure too it helps that they are shooting a lot of threes, and that's something where you're going to get a lot more. Some of the more of those long rebounds maybe where you've got guys on the defense that are boxing out close to the rim and it's like, no, I'll just grab it back here when it comes out a little bit further, on a missed three or something. But they're also, again, you think about what they're going to have with the physicality in the front court now, and just the overall size. I mean, it's going to be tough. And that's why I think you look at them and they do have the makeup of a team that I think can win this thing. Win the whole thing, not just the SEC, but
Yeah.
win the national title. And so, I think that's definitely something that's it's going to stand out with this team. But Max, as we continue to kind of look ahead with Alabama, let's make some picks here for some of the fun things we like to do. Our X Factor choice for the Tide, and as always, the X Factor can be whatever you want it to be. Depends on how you define what an X Factor is. But I'm curious where you're going to go with this one, Max.
Yeah, you mentioned my X Factor earlier, and I was trying to keep his name out of my mouth to give you a little shock right here, but I'm going Latrell Wrightsell. I'm going Trelly Wrightsell, and the reason why is because I think every team that we've done over the offseason, I've had like one guy where I've said his name has just been swept away in the flow of the offseason and everything. I feel like that's Latrell Wrightsell. When we talked to Chris Youngblood, he was like, guys, he is a dog. Okay, this guy is a dog. I think Nate Oats called him the best three-point shooter in the country. I might be wrong on that. It was either one of the best or the best, whatever way you want to swing it. This guy, watch that practice footage just because I know we've all seen Latrell Wrightsell, but go back and watch that practice footage. It is like if you give him an inch of space, it's not even like it's a swish because everyone likes a nice sound of the net swishing. But when it just barely touches the back of the rim and just goes right down, you're like, oh, gosh, this guy could probably shoot that 10 times over and do the same thing all 10 times. I'm telling you, this guy is probably going to be percentage-wise one of the best three-point shooters in the country this year. And he's just been forgotten. He has just completely been forgotten, I feel like, with all the hoopla that this offseason was. Latrell Wrightsell, remember the name.
All right, so I think that's certainly a possible choice. I think that's one of the best choices on the board. I mean, there are so many ways you could go with this.
You could go so many ways.
We know in normal circumstances, I would pick Chris Youngblood, but I guess if we're going to say he's going to miss the first part of the season, I won't pick him necessarily, but like for the stretch run, I will pick Chris Youngblood for all the reasons we've mentioned throughout the summer. If you've listened to our stuff, we talked about this guy time and time again, just in terms of what we think
probably
he's
too
going to
much
bring to this team. But so I'm going to go another direction here, and I think I'm going to go with, and this may be, I don't know. I mean, I think Jarin Stevenson is someone who we saw,
nice.
The big breakout game came against Clemson in the NCAA tournament, and I think when you consider that, look, I mean, Grant Nelson, Cliff, they're going to be getting all the attention, and though they're not going to be playing probably 40 minutes each or anything. There's going to be guys that are going to rotate in and out, but I think Stevenson's very interesting because if he can give them, look, I mean, we saw the production go up. The block numbers were going up at the end of the season. He had at least a block in I think 5 of the last 6 games or 5 of the last 7 games, something like that. How can he help him in terms of the outside shot, right? That's what stood out in that Clemson game. Made 5 threes. And so I think when you look at a guy like this who we know has NBA potential, I think it's going to be very fascinating to see how he plays into this, potentially as the X factor for this team.
When you started to lean into that, when you started to say, well, I might go this way, I was thinking Jarin Stevenson in the back of my mind. I was like, I like that pick. Yeah. I like it a lot because he's also extremely young. The sophomore breakout is there.
Year. Yeah. I think you got to remember that too. Like you can look at the numbers last year and be like, well, he didn't do this well, or there was some inconsistency here or there, but he's a freshman. And I think now that sophomore jump we always talk about, I like him potentially being a breakout player for this team. So give me Jarin Stevenson as the X factor to really make this a dominant front court from top to bottom. So, all right, MVP, Max.
MVP. Okay, yep. Let me just, I know we all know who the MVP is. Probably the best guard in the country, Mark Sears. Just game changer. Also, his ability to finish through contact doesn't get talked about enough. I mean, that guy can throw himself like he's going at a 12-man pad in football practice and still going to finish. He had this one play in the practice clip where I think he literally just lowered his shoulder into Mo Diabate and finished. I was like, how did that thing end up in the basket? But I have a little co-MVP because I know that everyone's just going to be like, oh, obviously Mark Sears. I think that Grant Nelson and the step that he could take and the mismatch nightmare that he could be in his true role as a stretch four, not having to guard Zach Edey for 40 minutes. I think Grant Stevenson. You got me doing that again. This is gonna be a
Can we get a
problem.
T-shirt for that?
This is gonna be a problem.
Can we get a T-shirt? Like, surely we can just get a T-shirt to start doing that. So,
Grant Nelson, I think he could be the guy. You saw it against North Carolina down the stretch. I think he could be the guy that, say Mark Sears is just getting so much attention and maybe the threes aren't falling. Nelson's the guy you can dish it down to that'll get you a bucket and one, break down a one-on-one matchup.
All right. Well, just so for everyone who knows, Grant Stevenson was a former Canadian hockey player for the San Jose Sharks.
Jeez.
So, I don't want to just tell anybody we're not going to a different sport here, but I had to Google that for a second. But Cliff Omoruyi too, I think is in the running here because I think when we talk about most valuable player, I mean, I think again when you think about what he's going to bring to the team, I feel like he's going to be in that conversation too. But this points out the reason why Alabama is such a potential juggernaut, I think, this season is because they have multiple MVP type candidates on this team. And I think you could argue they have multiple SEC Player of the Year type candidates on this team. And that's just not something, again, you're going to see with every team, I think, in this league. So, I think our picks, I'm going to go the same. I mean, Sears is going to be the pick, but I think you go Nelson, Amore, either one. And I think that there's potential there that you're going to get it right. So, all right, let's go with our prediction for Alabama for the 24-25 season. I mean, here's the deal, Max. We don't like to set unrealistic expectations on anyone. But, if Alabama doesn't make the second weekend of the NCAA tournament, it's going to be disappointing. If Alabama doesn't finish in the top 3 in the SEC, I think it's going to be disappointing because this, as you said earlier, Nate Oats himself said it, if this is the deepest roster he's had there, we know the expectations coming off of Final Four. I mean, the next step is to win a national championship, right? I mean, you just made it to a Final Four. Getting back there, certainly quite an achievement, would be incredible to do that in back-to-back seasons. But this is a team that has national championship aspirations, and I think they're good enough to win the whole thing with the right matchup. We always say, I hesitate to say those kind of things until you see the bracket, but talent-wise, they should be able to match up with anybody out there. And so from that perspective, yes, to me, Alabama's good enough to win the national championship. If you're looking at where do things go wrong, I mean, I don't really have anything to say except for injuries. Like, I mean, again, because we see one guy out to start, the first couple months, how does that impact the team if you get another injury? And I know, like, we can say that about any team. So if that's what we have to use, it's not three-point shooting, it's not rebounding, it's not rim. I think the defense is going to be better. And I know last year the defense was the problem, as we said at times, but I just think the defense is going to be better this year. And I think you've made some additions that are going to help that. But if you're going to just pick a couple of things, injuries, maybe the defense doesn't get to the level we thought it would. But guess what? Even at times last year, if they struggled defensively, they could score enough that it didn't matter. So I don't really have a lot in terms of where this could go wrong for Alabama. I think they're a top 3 team in the SEC no matter what. And I think, of course, the ceiling is winning it all.
Yeah, so before I get into my prediction, quick scheduling note that I found. Bart Torvik projects odds for the entire season, so they're not accurate at all. Obviously, they'll change from game to game. But as of right now, Alabama is projected to be the underdog in 3 of their non-conference games when they go to Purdue on the 15th of November, when they got to play Houston and Vegas at late November, and then when they have to go to Chapel Hill to play North Carolina for the
Yep.
ACC SEC Challenge. Those are the only 3 games they're underdogs in. I think pretty much everyone in the country would be underdogs in those games. They're projected favorites over Creighton in that rematch from last year. I know that has turned into one of the weird rivalries, I feel like, in the sport. But I agree with you. I think the defense can be better. I currently only hold one national title future ticket. It's Alabama, 18-1. I don't have anything else. So you talking ceiling? Yeah, national championship. Guards win in March. I think they got the best guard in the country in Mark Sears. If things don't go well, like we always try to say, well, no, don't say injuries because everyone could just say injuries. Well, they already kind of have them. So I guess we can. I think if things don't go well, I think Chris Youngblood is so much more important than we thought at the wing. Derrion Reid is listed at 6'8", 220. I feel like he's a big wing. Like he's more of a 3-4 than he is a 2-3. So I think if things go wrong, I think maybe you drop all 3 of those really tough non-con games. The wing is a little bit of an issue. There's too much pressure on Mark Sears. Maybe the rotation's a little bit weird, and you can't really find your groove until the guys come back. But that is like, I am nitpicking heavy there. I mean, other than these injuries in the beginning of the season here, I don't see how this team doesn't figure it out with the depth they have.
Yep. And I mean, again, I don't think you can underestimate what that Final Four run did in terms of giving the pieces on this roster, which there are quite a few still, who got there and were big parts of that, and what that does for a team's confidence and just ability when they get in those close games to know that they have been here before and they know how to win these kind of games. So you're going to have quite a few of those in the SEC this year, best league in the country potentially. And so, yeah, I think it sets up very nicely for the Crimson Tide coming off a Final Four run. So there you go, Max. Our thoughts on Alabama heading into the 2024-25 season in college basketball. We're previewing all the SEC teams heading into the year. You can check out all of our stuff here on the channel, football, baseball. Of course, we got basketball covered wall to wall this season. So be sure to hit that subscribe button and check out everything else we got here on the channel. We appreciate you watching, as always, and we'll talk to you again here soon at Southeastern 16.